The finishing touches may not be quite finished. I'm sorry? I feel that way and I appreciate it. All right, moving on. Where are we here? Well, we're on session number 2. This is the session where I'm going to talk about how to capture infrared images and how to process them, drilling down considerably deeper than last time. And only, especially on the post-processing part, still only really scratching the surface. There are a lot of things you can do when you're post-processing these images and a lot of tools available, lots of different choices to make. I'll illustrate a few of those, but I could spend a whole week teaching all the gory details and nuances and stuff and never run out of stuff to say. I might run out of students, but not stuff to say. So with that as another caveat, let's move on. Our next session, scheduled for November 29th, I've actually thought it through and I have a plan. Here's my plan. Prescott, in a nutshell, is where I want to take everybody. There are 3 places there, even in late November, where I think we can get good infrared photos. One of them is Willow Lake. Easy to find, easy to get to. You park right next to a walkway that goes along the lake. It's not challenging at all. Beautiful granite boulders with all kinds of interesting patterns. I actually was planning on showing an image that I captured last January. There are a lot of trees there, including one variety of oaks that are not deciduous. I shot that oak last January, and it still had leaves on it. So you can get some foliage there. And as I say, lots of interesting scenes and lots of interesting rocks along the lake there, and it's an easy walk. So that's the first destination I have in mind. Then Mount Vernon Avenue, and I think, Janet, you told me you've been there with me years and years ago when I did a trip there to shoot architecture, shoot these houses. It's one of the main roads leading out of Prescott to the Senator Highway, which goes up into the Bradshaw Mountains. And there are about 3 blocks there that have a bunch of old Victorian houses. They're very well maintained, they're very attractive, and they're very good subjects for infrared. So we'll give those a try. And then if there's time, and if everybody isn't already worn out, we can also drive up Mount Vernon Road until it turns into the Senator Highway, and that takes you to Goldwater Lake. And Goldwater Lake, there are actually 2 Goldwater Lakes I found by looking at the map. There's a big one and a little one. They're both listed as parks, and to be honest, I've never been there, although I've seen plenty of photos from them. But they're up high enough that they have ponderosas surrounding them, and as I mentioned last week, ponderosas tend to glow in infrared more than a lot of other trees do. So that'll be a good thing to shoot as well. That's the 3rd stop, if there's time and if everybody isn't already totally worn out by what we've already done. So I propose that we meet at 11:30 a.m. at the McDonald's in Camp Verde, right off of I-17. And that happens to be right on the way, for an easy place for Larry to join us since he lives in Camp Verde, and John too, living in Cottonwood, can easily meet us there. And we can arrange carpooling. Anybody who lives in Sedona is welcome to carpool with me, at least until my car fills up. And those of you who live in Flagstaff or Cottonwood or Camp Verde, you can meet us at the McDonald's, and then we'll shuffle people around among cars at that point, leave 1 or 2 cars at the McDonald's, and probably take only 2 cars, given how many people we have, probably take only 2 cars into Prescott. So we can spend the afternoon shooting in Prescott, and then if everybody's willing, there's a nice brewery in Prescott that has good burgers and stuff. And we can consider other places too, possibly, but I've been to that brewery before, although not recently, and it's a nice place. So that the one, I don't recall the name of the one. It's right on Courthouse Square, right across the street from the courthouse. I don't remember what it's called. I don't recall that pig is in the name, but we'll find it. I'll double check. Okay, well, I'll double check and make sure. And, happy to take other nominations for places, and we can you know, we can sort it out in real time after we've done our shooting if we want. We don't have to decide right away. So does that plan work for everybody? Can everybody meet us on November 29th, 11:30 at the McDonald's? And as I say, you guys who live in Sedona, you're in Cottonwood too, right, Tim?
Yeah.
Okay. So, yeah. Okay, yeah. So you guys, you don't even live all that far from each other. So yeah, you guys can carpool with me if you want. Just drive to my house and we'll take off from there. So that should work pretty well. Okay, moving on. That come through? Yes. All right, good. So here are our topics for today. Basically, stuff about how to operate your camera and how to set it, and stuff about post-processing. I envision the post-processing to take longer because although there are some things with your camera settings and camera operation that are specific to IR, primarily it's not all that different from shooting visible light. And what we'll talk about is the differences. Post-processing, as I say, I could talk all week about post-processing. So I'll sort of skim the surface of that, drill down in 2 or 3 specific places, and leave a knot. You know, it's possible even we'll want to schedule additional sessions eventually to drill down in some of these things some more, but we'll leave that for a later decision. So moving to the camera topics. First of all, what camera do you guys all have now? First of all, does everybody have an infrared camera at this point? You don't. I know you were talking about it, but
I don't have one yet.
Oh, you've ordered one though, right?
Yeah, but I don't know if it'll be in time because they're saying 3 to 4 weeks. So.
Okay, but you sent it in last week.
Yeah, I didn't send it in right after I talked to you.
Oh, okay. Well, anyhow, yeah, hopefully you'll get it in time. If not, I actually have multiple cameras. I'm not sure about the oldest one. I'm not sure if it still works or if it will work, but I can bring both of them and let people trade off a little bit. If you don't have a camera, I can let you guys do a little shooting, and we'll have to figure out a way to remember which images on the memory card are whose, but we can do that. And then I can share those with you afterwards, and you can exercise what you learned here to process them. So we'll figure it out. But I know, Mark, you have a camera, Larry does, John does, and Mary does. So, okay. So 4 out of 6 here have cameras, and that's a good number. We'll work it out. All right. So what cameras do the 4 of you who already have them? And actually, Tim, you've ordered one too. So which camera do you use?
D800.
D800? Okay. Good choice. Z6. Good choice.
D700.
D700. And yours is with an 8 or a 720. Yeah, okay. All right, and John?
I have a Nikon Z6 Mark II, full spectrum.
Full spectrum. And then you have filters to put over the lens. Yeah, okay. Ditto, okay, well. It's amazing, yeah, we're all Nikon shooters. And that was true, I don't know what it is, but for the group that I led to Colorado.
Well, Canon people just can't catch up.
I guess that's right. I know plenty of people who shoot Canon cameras still, or used to shoot them at least. A lot of people have switched to Sonys. Anyway, well, good. I mean, the good thing about all that is as we talk about camera settings, I won't have to talk about too many caveats about how things might work differently on different brands of cameras, because we all have the same brand of cameras. So that's a fortunate happenstance. Okay, well, moving on. So first, some general ideas about camera settings and practices for shooting infrared. Absolutely always shoot raw. As I say, except no substitutes, because there really isn't any good substitute for shooting raw. If you shoot JPEG, and I'll actually even show you an example of what I mean later on when we're talking about histograms, but if you shoot JPEG, you're throwing away a lot of information, and it's information that's pretty important. So always shoot raw. White balance. Infrared cameras that have been converted infrared weren't designed with infrared in mind, of course. They were designed with visible light in mind. So what you see on the LCD screen isn't necessarily very representative of what you want to get when you process the infrared images. And also, if you're shooting raw, the white balance setting on your camera ultimately doesn't really matter because it doesn't affect what goes into the raw file. You set the white balance when you do the raw conversions, raw processing. So my advice is set the white balance to whatever you want that helps you see the image as best you can on your LCD screen, because that helps you evaluate the image after you've captured it. Some cameras support custom white balances, and that can help. We don't have time today to go into how to do it. The one that I've shot the large majority of my infrared images on is the Nikon D3200, which I converted years ago to a 590 or nanometer filter. And it doesn't have a wide enough range in its white balance settings to give you a custom white balance that actually looks reasonably good. So I don't bother. I just set it to auto white balance, and yeah, you don't get the best looking image on the back of the camera when you shoot with that camera. But I've kind of learned, partly by looking at the histogram, how to evaluate those images anyway. So I just don't worry about it. So that's my advice for white balance in the camera. As I say, it doesn't ultimately matter except in terms of how it helps you evaluate the image after you've taken your
So if
shot.
you change the Kelvin settings, you get different results.
You'll definitely see different colors, yeah, on the back of your camera. But none of those settings necessarily represent what you're ultimately shooting for when you process the image. So don't be swayed too much by them. Moving on here. Where are we here? Oh, sorry. Yeah, go ahead, John.
With full spectrum, one of the things that was recommended to me was to do a white balance check every time I switch from one filter to another. What do you think of that?
I don't, well, because I just set it for auto white balance regardless, well, first of all, in my practice, regardless of the filter I'm using, I just set it for auto white balance and don't worry about it. If you're actually trying to judge the image and judge the white balance somehow by looking at that LCD screen, you're certainly welcome to change the white balance and do a custom white balance if you want. And as I say, if that helps you, more power to you. But I mostly shoot with the 550 nanometer filter on my full spectrum camera. I have occasionally swapped in other filters and sometimes just leave the filter off and shoot full spectrum too. But I just never pay much attention to what the colors look like when I look at the LCD screen. So I'm not the best person to ask, probably. I can't really offer very.
I can tell you with the Z6 mine does, I'm able to set a custom white balance while I'm shooting, but not all my cameras are able to. If you talk to my Pixel, apparently it's a characteristic of Nikon. So I'm fortunate, for some reason my camera does, but the guy told me you're lucky because not all of them actually believe it. You have to acquire the data, and they'll say you can't acquire the data, but mine works. So I don't know, you just have to practice. But he's right. I mean, once you process it, that kind of goes out the window anyways. But if you want to see it,
I've noted that the number of wavelengths will only acquire the correct data. Right. So I am shooting basically shot.
Shooting what? Sorry. Oh, yeah. Yeah. So, yeah. So does that answer your question adequately? As I say, don't sweat the white balance too much when you're shooting because it doesn't affect your raw file. Just, set it to whatever works best for you when you're actually looking at the LCD screen. Okay, so I've harped repeatedly about the histogram already, but a little bit more info about that. Your camera, as I keep saying, was designed with visible light in mind, not infrared light. So your built-in light meter may not be all that accurate when you're shooting infrared. And it's best to keep it honest by looking at that histogram after every shot, or at least after every shot where something has changed significantly, like the exposure or the lighting conditions or something. Sorry.
The new filter?
New filter for sure, yeah. Yeah, the filters will definitely alter the exposure settings on your camera. And you can imagine why, because different filters pass more or less of the visible band of wavelengths. And what that means is that more or less light is hitting your sensor. So yeah, they will definitely affect your exposure settings, quite likely. So best advice is check that old histogram every chance you get. And certainly every time something has changed significantly, and just make sure the exposure settings you have are working.
I have a question with that. When we
Sure.
were in Mexico, I'd go into the RGB channels. I think the regular histogram is what they're shooting the channel histogram. Look at it. And it was really hard to get a good exposure with the red, blue, and with the blue, green, and red. What I usually see would be red would be way over on the right, and green and blue would be way over on the left.
Okay, go. Well, sorry, finish your question.
So that was what I was thinking.
Okay.
Is that a good exposure? So if I adjusted the red to be fully in range, then the blues and greens are like way up against the edge.
Well, I want everybody to know that Larry here is not a plant, but he has given us the perfect segue into the next slide. All right, so here's the next slide. What does a histogram look like when you're shooting IR? Ideally, it looks what I call balanced, and balanced is, and it's definitely different from the histogram you're shooting for if you're shooting visible photography, visible light photography. And I'm going to show you an example now, which means I have to, we're not even worrying about Zoom right now, so I'm not going to worry about sharing a different screen or anything. I'm just going to go to Photoshop here. And if I've done everything right here,
Yeah, don't change it. It's here for, it's not on mine, but don't worry about that.
Here's the histogram on the back of my D3200 for an image that I shot during that photo walk in Flagstaff. This is the Motel du Beau with the big sign above it and the courtyard down below. And if you look at the three color channels in this histogram, you're actually seeing exactly what Larry has described. Great work, Larry. Appreciate it. But you can see that the red channel shows lots of pixels bunched up against the right axis here, meaning those pixels look like they're overexposed. And other than that, the pixels are pretty nicely distributed. There aren't any against the dark axis, the left axis. So, you know, the shadows all have detail on the red channel. The green channel shows a bunch of them bunched up against the dark axis, the left axis. So those are underexposed. And the blue channel doesn't look too different from the green channel, but it does have good data even in the darkest pixels. None of them are bunched up against that left axis here. So that's what that histogram looks like for this particular image on the back of my camera. I just photographed this morning with my cell phone on the back of the camera. Now, what do these pixels represent? Well, all of those that are bunched up against the right axis, first of all, especially in the red channel, those represent the sky and this really bright area of the sky primarily. And then those that are down here in the darker part of the histogram is all of this area here that's in shadow. And the sun is behind the building here, but you can see all the light from the sun in the sky there too. And then blue, you can see all the blue channel pixels. They tend to be down in the shadows, and that's what that histogram represents. This is actually maybe not quite ideal, but it's actually a very good histogram for an infrared image on this camera. But there's an interesting thing here going on. If you look at that same histogram when you first load the raw image in Photoshop, it doesn't look like this. Now let's see if I have the right, that's not it. That's not it. So this, no. Is that it? No. Okay, I'm gonna have to find the right image to open here. Hang on. Sorry. Let me go back to bridge. Here we go. I'm going to open that not in Photoshop, but in Camera Raw, actually. And this is the totally unprocessed image. Can you see that? Yeah, good. This is the, oh, and then I got to get this out of the way because it's.
Just hit that one bar, on the far left. Yeah, hit that. There, minimize. There we go.
Okay, good. Okay, good. So if you remember what that histogram looked like on the back of the camera, look at how different this one is. The red channel, first of all, doesn't look like it's blown out at all. There's plenty of room here between the brightest pixels and the right axis. Other than that, it looks pretty similar. You can see plenty of pixels distributed toward the dark end of that histogram as well. The blue channel looks very similar to the shape it had on the back of the camera. The green channel looks extremely different. There's almost no pixels down here in the darker half of that histogram. There are a few, but not very many. Almost all of the green channel pixels are basically black. There's no data there at all. It's totally underexposed. So why is this different? Why is it so different? Why do the camera and Camera Raw tell us different stories here? Well, it's because there's a detail that a lot of people probably aren't aware of with respect to how the cameras generate a histogram to show you. The one in Photoshop actually tells the truth much more closely than the one on the back of your camera, which is a little bit unfortunate because it's the one on the back of your camera that you use to evaluate your exposures. But what happens is when a camera generates a RAW file, it also, even if you're not telling it to save a JPEG, it still converts that image to a JPEG file and then stores a smaller version of that embedded in the RAW file. And then when you go back to display that image on your LCD screen in the camera, it doesn't read the raw data out of the image and convert it again to something that can be displayed. Instead, it gets lazy. It just reads that JPEG that's embedded in the raw file, puts that on your LCD screen, and if you generate a histogram from that, that's the histogram it shows you. So what that's telling you, first of all, is a great way to emphasize why I tell people to shoot RAW. Because look at all the data that's been thrown away when the camera generated that JPEG file. It didn't have the dynamic range to record a value other than infinity for a lot of red pixels. And it also, it did weird stuff with the green channel too. And I think what's happening there is the camera is sort of trying to deduce what the green channel should look like by looking at the other two channels. I don't really know that for sure. But obviously that green histogram looks much different from what the raw files looks like in Camera Raw. So with all of that said, I'm kind of impugning the reputation of your camera and the histogram that it displays. It's not really quite telling you the truth about what's really in that raw file, but it's doing the best it can under the circumstances without having to do a lot of extra processing, which takes time, generates heat, uses your battery. That's probably why the camera manufacturers do it that way. But in any case, it's not totally telling you the truth, but at least it's giving you an approximation. And this is what I mean by balanced. You have pixels that occupy pretty much the full range of brightness levels from black to white, but the color channels are sort of balanced in the sense that, and as Larry observed, your red channel is most likely the one that's going to be a lot brighter than the other two channels, according to the histogram. And that's what this one shows. And the blue channel has data which is darker because your most IR filters have cut off the blue end of the visible spectrum. So that data is a lot darker. And the green channel, take my word for it, just doesn't matter. At least with this camera and this filter, there's so little data in that green channel in the raw file that it makes no difference whatsoever in the final image. And I'll show you an example of that when we talk about converting, or I'll show you how that works or why it's that way when we talk about converting the raw image. Anyway, back to the slides here. Let me find them. Is that full screen? No. So can I make it start the slideshow again? Yes, all right, how about that? Okay, so back to the slides here. So remember that the camera shows you the histogram for the JPEG image, not the actual raw data. And what that means is it's probably okay if, when you look at it on the camera, the red channel looks like it's blown out to some degree, and the blue channel can look the opposite. It can look pretty seriously underexposed and still give you fine results when you're processing the raw file. And as I say, don't even worry about that green channel unless you find some instance where it makes a difference. And it depends on the filter you're using too, of course. But in most cases, it probably won't make any difference at all. We're going to have that problem again, though, when I show examples.
Well, you just got to pick the right one.
I know, yeah.
Okay.
All right. So talking about focus. First of all, you may or may not want to do this, and I'll be perfectly honest with you. I haven't, this is basically the process for testing the focus of a lens and figuring out if it works well for infrared. And I haven't actually done this to the degree that it's described here. But if I ever got a new lens that I wanted to use with infrared, this is the first thing I would do with it. And the reason for that is because, again, lenses were designed with visible light in mind, not infrared in general. And the camera, the autofocus mechanism in your camera was also designed with the visible light in mind, not infrared. So there's some possible deviations there between how a lens works and how it focuses between infrared and visible light. This is the way to tell how much of a deviation there is and whether that lens will really work for you or not in infrared, as far as focus goes. So capture a scene with autofocus and then also capture the scene manually focusing it using live view mode if it's a DSLR, or using the 100% magnification on your LCD screen on a mirrorless camera too. Some cameras have focus peaking, that'll probably help you here. But focus the camera as best you can manually and then take the same shot. And then evaluate those two raw files and see if they really look alike or not with respect to focus. You can do this at different wavelengths if you have multiple filters. You can do it at different apertures. If it's if it's a zoom lens, you can do it at different focal lengths as well. And you can compare all those results, the autofocused one versus the manually focused one, and see what works best, see which looks better. And if there's a large or significant deviation between the autofocus and the manual focus, then you potentially have a problem. That lens may not work very well in autofocus mode when you're shooting infrared. In my experience, I've only actually had one lens where I had a very significant autofocus issue, or significant focus issue in general. And I don't even know that that was an autofocus issue. It may just be that that lens is just plain fuzzy and at infrared and wouldn't autofocus or wouldn't focus manually or automatically, regardless. But if you want to be certain about it, or if you want to get a good idea of whether a lens works for you at infrared, this is the way I would recommend doing it. But pay attention to the last bullet point there too. The tools we have to enhance focus these days are pretty amazing, truly. And one of the lenses I have that I use on that Nikon D52 or 3200, it's a Nikon 18 to 140 millimeter super zoom lens. And if you look at the raw images on that, from that lens, whether visible light or infrared, I use that lens for both visible and infrared photography. The images don't look all that sharp. The edges and the edges are definitely kind of fuzzy, But if you run them through Topaz Photo AI or Topaz Sharpen AI, or use the sharpening capabilities in the DxO raw converter, not a problem. Really isn't. So you may or may not ever want to do this or need to, but it's definitely worth knowing that there are potential focus issues when you're shooting a lens at infrared wavelengths, and possibly what to do about it. Moving on, if this will advance for me now. Now it won't advance for me. Let's see if I can click. There we go.
Okay.
Is that the, yeah, okay. All right. The other issue, which I talked about a little bit last time, is the hotspot in a lens. And as I mentioned last time, you know, some lenses are pretty prone to those hotspots. Some are almost immune to them, but there are a lot of nuances there. And pretty much any lens I've used for infrared gives you a hotspot under at least some conditions. So you might want to test, especially again, if it's a new lens that you haven't shot with infrared previously, you might want to test it for hotspots before you go out and use it in a real shoot. And I won't bore you by walking through all these steps here, but this is how you do that. Everybody okay if we move on, just in the interest of time? All right. Will it advance? Oh, it worked for me. Go figure. Okay. Questions or discussion before we move on to the next topic, which is post-processing? Yes, Tim.
Is there any advantage when you're shooting infrared to shoot both the RAW and the JPEG? And then put the JPEG on a different. I just want to know if there's.
I'm not a good guy to ask because I just don't shoot JPEGs except on that D3200. I actually have it set for JPEG plus RAW, so I get both.
Yeah.
The only conceivable circumstance where well, there are two circumstances where I would look at the JPEG. One is if I just want to have a quick and dirty way to review all the images, and I don't want to have to wait for Bridge to create a preview for me. I just look at the JPEGs.
It'll show close to what it really will look like.
Oh, no, not even close.
Okay.
But it doesn't even come close to what you'll ultimately get when you convert the raw file and post-process it. And it's with that camera, it's very ugly, almost without exception.
Okay.
So no, I have pretty much no real use for the JPEGs other than quick reviews. Once or twice in all the time I've been shooting digital photography, I've managed to lose a raw file or have it get corrupted on the memory card or something, and the JPEG is still there and intact. And so I have used the JPEG under those circumstances as a poor man's backup, but I don't know, it's been years since I've even bothered to try doing that because I haven't lost an image in all that time that had a JPEG backup. So, you know, I don't really have much use for the JPEGs out of the camera at all. This is a short answer, the long answer to that question. Any others before we move on? Okay, we're going to move on to post-processing now. And some general observations about post-processing, first of all. There's no universal workflow. Every image is potentially different, and they will lead you where they want to go if you let them, and sometimes it's a pretty good idea to let them. There's no right or wrong way to post-process a infrared image because nobody expects it to look like what your eye would see. That's one fundamental difference between infrared and visible light photography, is that you have totally free reign to do whatever you want to with those infrared images, and nobody can legitimately criticize you for what you've done with them because you're not trying to mimic what their eyes can see. Trial and error is okay, in fact, encouraged. I do it all the time. As I said earlier, images lead you where they want to go. At least they lead me where they want to go. And I often don't have a preconceived notion of what the final result is going to look like when I start processing an infrared image. Occasionally I do, but sometimes I end up being wrong about that and it takes me somewhere else too. So you just never know. And your mileage will vary. Everybody has a different style for what appeals to their eye and a different way of interacting with their computer and their tools. So I'll show you how I do it, but, and you're welcome to imitate the way I do it as much as you want, but the odds are you'll come up with something different. And if you do, I want to hear about it because I might want to do it that way too. Okay, so moving on. First of all, talking about raw conversion. What raw converter do we use? White balance, sharpening, other things you do during raw conversion to fix potential issues or improve the quality of your image. Tips, tricks, and hazards. I'll talk about those, and I don't even know if I've organized the slides such that I cover that particularly during raw conversion. I think it's later in the slide package than that, but we'll see when we get there. As I say, the finishing touches might not be quite finished yet. All right, so what raw converter should you use? And my short glib answer, as is frequently the case, is whichever one works best for you. And the best way to figure out which one that is by trying them and finding out. Some of them, there are a number of different raw converters out there, and some of the people or some of the companies that make them even let you do free trials before you have to buy their software. So it's worth exploring that if you're not totally happy with Adobe Camera Raw or Lightroom, which is the same raw converter really. They're under the hood, they're exactly the same. But there are two that I have used, and I started out years ago, like 9 or 10 years ago now, when I first started doing infrared. I started out using nothing but Adobe Camera Raw. And more recently, I've started using DxO Photo Lab. And I'll talk more about both of those. And now my first choice is usually DxO rather than Adobe Camera Raw. But looking at Camera Raw, there are some advantages to it and some potential drawbacks too, but it has very precise color adjustments and controls. DxO comes close, but it definitely doesn't have all the nuances and capabilities that Camera Raw does, or Lightroom, as I say. I'll use those two terms pretty much interchangeably in most instances when they come up, by the way, because under the hood, they're the same raw converter. They have great tools for localized adjustments and removing dust spots and things like that. You might need a custom color profile, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. But a custom profile helps you get a wider range of white balance adjustments than you can out of the box if you're using the built-in color profiles that Adobe Camera Raw comes with. The latest version of Lightroom and Camera Raw has some really good sophisticated masking features, and I do occasionally use those. And those are definitely superior to what you can do in DxO or, as far as I know, any other raw converter. So that's one potential reason for using those, the Camera Raw or Lightroom. But Photoshop has most of the same capabilities, so you can do those same masking things in Photoshop that you can in the raw conversion, so it's not necessarily an advantage. One really significant advantage about Camera Raw, and I don't think this really applies to Lightroom in this particular case, although I don't have enough experience with Lightroom to tell you for sure. But Camera Raw, coupled with Adobe Bridge, integrates really nicely with the automation capabilities of Photoshop. And so, and I use that sometimes, I shoot dancers, I shoot musicians, I come home with hundreds or thousands of images from those photo shoots. And I might pick out, 200 of them that I want to convert to a JPEG and share with whoever I'm working with. But I want to do some adjustments that are identical for every one of those in the process of preparing those JPEGs, like add a signature to it or put a vignette on it, or if they're black and white, maybe put some color toning on them. I can set up a Photoshop action that does those things and then apply that action to all 200 of those images through Bridge and Camera Raw. And then I can go have a cup of coffee and come back in 10 minutes and presto, they're all done. It's really, really powerful. And I don't use that very often for infrared images, but if I ever had to, and there have been times where I have done it, it's there and it's really powerful. You can also do it though, they don't have to be raw files, of course, to do it that way. You can also do it on files that you've already post-processed. So the integration with the raw conversion capability may or may not be very useful to you, but in case it is, so much the better, it's there. Moving on, DxO Photo Lab. It's a very powerful alternative to Camera Raw and or Lightroom. It's really excellent at balancing shadows and highlights, and there's that word balance popping up again. It's so good at that it's almost like having a poor man's HDR program built into your raw converter. And I'm not exaggerating there. I'll try and show you an example or two. It's more powerful for visible light than infrared images in that respect, because by default, you know, especially in a higher contrast scene, an outdoor scene on a sunny day or something like that, by default, the image out of the camera, a visible light image out of the camera especially, often has really dark shadows. And you would be amazed at how powerful DxO Photo Lab is at brightening up those shadows and making them look really nice and really balanced, just by sliding a slider. It's really simple. It works for infrared images too, of course, and I do use it, but it's not quite as critical sometimes as it is with visible light, but it's still very powerful. It now has, DxO Photo Lab now has a really exceptional noise removal tool. It's probably, well, I don't know if it's arguably the best one out there. I've tried several and they all work pretty well, but not all under the same circumstances. But it's certainly mighty good, and I use it very routinely. It has a very good sharpening feature, and you notice I didn't say excellent, but it's very good. And the nice thing about DxO Photo Lab, you know how Camera Raw and Lightroom have lens profiles that correct for vignetting and chromatic aberration and that sort of thing. They have a separate profile for every lens, not quite every lens that's ever been invented, but any that you're likely to use in most circumstances. That's very handy. DxO goes one step better, because they generate those profiles for every lens on every camera. So if there are any nuances with respect to how the lens interacts with the camera, they correct for that. And it's amazingly powerful. So it's very good at correcting chromatic aberration. The caveat is they do that with visible light, not infrared. So I can't guarantee it'll work perfectly every time for infrared, but it's still an advantage over Camera Raw or Lightroom in that respect.
What version are you using?
The latest, I think it might be 7.
7?
Yeah. So as I mentioned a little earlier, well, first of all, choosing what converter to use, you don't have to choose just one, first of all. And there are times where I've tried both Camera Raw and Photo Lab for the same image and chosen the one that works best for that image. It takes time, of course, but it's worth it sometimes. And as I mentioned, I started out using Camera Raw. Lately, I've used DxO a lot more than Camera Raw because it saves me time, because of that built-in HDR capability and the fact that the sharpening, good sharpening, not the world's best, but very good sharpening, good enough for my purposes in most cases, is built into the raw conversion process, and the noise reduction also is built into the conversion process. And the noise removal really is world class. So I can recommend it pretty highly. So moving on, what's next here? An unprocessed image is usually not very pleasing. You saw one example earlier already, and it looked pretty ugly to my eye and not even close to what I want that image to look like after I've worked it up. What it'll look like on your on the back of your camera depends on your white balance settings and things like that, and also on the cutoff filter you use. But it's probably going to be pretty ugly and not close to what you want. If you're using Lightroom or ACR, Adobe Camera Raw, you probably want to apply a custom white balance profile. And we don't have time today for me to show you how to generate that profile. I sent you a link last time, and I've actually included the same links at the end of the package for this session as well. There are a couple of different links there that have two different versions of how to generate such a white balance profile for your camera, and it will definitely help you. Not absolutely essential, but I use it anytime I use Adobe Camera Raw. I always apply a custom white balance profile that I generated for my specific camera when I do the conversion. DxO doesn't need it. DxO has a wider range out of the box of white balance adjustments. And so I've been able to get away without trying to fiddle with any custom profile or anything when using DxO.
I don't think so. It's kind of has a red cast. I don't know if that was just that image. I haven't tried it on others.
Well, I don't know what to tell you without seeing the image and seeing what settings you used when you processed it. But it certainly has a very wide range of color adjustments built in, including, what do they call it? Color grading. It has a pretty sophisticated color grading capability built in. So I would guess that with the right settings, you could probably get rid of that that red cast.
But just out of the box using the white balance, you know.
Oh, well, yeah, red cast, I mean, out of the box, any infrared image is going to have a.
DxO's custom eye dropper. If I click on whatever I want neutral in the photo, it still has a red cast, whereas in ACR, if I have the custom white balance, I don't have that.
Oh, okay.
So that's just a little more processing, but it's.
Yeah, because probably you could use the sliders then to get rid of that red cast.
There is a difference.
Oh, yeah, that's true.
Nikon's NX Studio actually does the very best. But then you have to deal with the TIFF file.
Yeah, and I haven't used Nikon's tool very much.
Because it's
probably
slow right now.
Yeah, it's slow, and it's nowhere near as sophisticated as either of the other tools. Yeah. So in the interest of time, I'm not going to try and talk about it any further, but yeah. So let's move on here. If these are sort of a skeleton of the steps you might use when you're using Adobe Camera Raw or Lightroom to process a raw file, and I'll read them briefly just so I remember to remind myself what we're talking about here. Apply a custom white balance if you need it. In any case, you're going to adjust the white balance and probably color saturation and things like that. Exposure, contrast, highlights, shadows, clarity setting, things like that. Those are all similar to what you would do with a visible light image, so I don't have to talk about those too much here, I don't think. Optionally, sharpening and lens corrections can be applied in Camera Raw. And in general, when I'm using Camera Raw, I don't sharpen. I don't use the built-in sharpening or noise reduction in Camera Raw. I set those sliders to 0. And the reason for that is if you're using Topaz software to do your sharpening or your noise reduction afterwards, they specifically tell you, turn off those things in your raw conversion if you're going to use them on the converted image afterwards. And the reason for that is that, and I have firsthand experience with this, if you do any sharpening in Camera Raw, it actually creates a faint little halo around your edges that you can't see. And, it's pretty much invisible on pretty much any image I've done that way, but it's there. And if you then take the Topaz tools and sharpen that image further, it sharpens that halo and makes it much more visible. But if you don't use the sharpening in Camera Raw, just turn the slider down to 0, then that halo isn't there, and then you don't see it after you've run the topaz tool.
Do you have trouble with DxO if you do raw?
Less. I typically don't sharpen images after I've processed them with DxO because they don't need any more sharpening in most cases. Have been exceptions to that. I've been able to apply just a little bit more sharpening with the topaz tool in post-processing without any real penalty. So again, that's one of the reasons I prefer DxO generally these days over Camera Raw. So anyhow, enough about sharpening. Lens corrections you can apply. Chromatic aberration, you can use Camera Raw to correct for chromatic aberration. I'll come back to that topic later because there's a little nuance or hazard there that I actually haven't even quite figured out yet myself. But anyhow, I usually do turn on chromatic aberration corrections when I'm processing images, whether in Camera Raw or DxO. Dust spot removal, do that when you process the image. Tonal adjustments, things like that, you're certainly welcome to do those when you're processing the raw image. I typically don't myself, but there's no reason you can't if that seems to be needed for a given image. Moving on, let's see here. I have, yeah. Okay, you might recall last time I showed the picture of that tree house, and that's not being shared yet. So let's see if I can. Yeah. All right, I'm gonna switch the setting here. Did that do it? Oh, all right, let's try. Okay, well, I just set it back to the way it was set, when we started, when I switched slides, but somehow it didn't follow until I changed it manually. Okay, so you might remember that last time I showed a picture of this tree house on the grounds of a coffee company in Hawaii. And this is the totally unprocessed raw image.
I don't know why.
All right, well. Oh, I know what happened. Yeah, I have to click keep changes here. That's why it timed out. Now it should stick. Is it up there now? No. Okay. All right. This is that coffee house on the grounds of the coffee company in Hawaii. And this is the totally unprocessed raw image straight out of my D3200 590 nanometer filter. And if you're wondering what that weird shape is at the top, that's my left hand. That's because there was lens flare. The sun was just out of the frame up above me. So I put my hand over the lens to block the sun from shining on the front element of the lens. And I didn't care that it was also capturing my hand there because I had to put it where it was to completely eliminate that lens flare. And I figured I'd get rid of that. I'd crop it out in post-processing. So not a big deal. Anyway, here's what the image looks like unprocessed. Very different from the final image, which I'll show you eventually. But, and you saw it last time too. So the first thing I do, this is the color profile that it's providing here. Can you see the cursor, by the way, up there? Okay. This is the color profile, just the default Adobe color profile, which it applies to all cameras by default. And I've already loaded a custom white balance profile for this camera. So I'm going to go find it here. You click that drop down.
Is that a 590 filter?
Correct, yes. And then you go to the browse choice here. And by default, it shows you all of the Adobe profiles that they provide with Photoshop. And they got a bunch of them, all of which you can ignore. If you've installed a custom profile, you'll find it hidden way down here under profiles. And I actually have two different custom profiles for this camera. I pretty much always use this one here. So that's the one I'm going to apply. And you can see right away when I applied that, it changed the look of the image. I'm going to go back now. You have to click this back command to get out of that. And so now I've applied that custom profile. It still looks pretty ugly, but look where the white balance settings are here. They're way off to the side, nowhere near where I know they're going to end up. So there are multiple ways of adjusting the white balance here, and ultimately I always adjust it to taste. You can start by using the little eyedropper here to pick something that should be white, like the clouds, and let that set your white balance. But I can tell you, based on my experience with images like this, that went too far. It actually made those clouds white. And at least for starters, you don't necessarily want your clouds white. So what I typically end up doing is I set the blue-yellow slider to somewhere in this ballpark, and then I set the green-magenta slider somewhere a little bit to the right of center, so that you get clear distinction between the blues at one end of the spectrum and the reds at the other end of the spectrum in the image. And you can alter the look of that a bit by experimenting with different positions for these sliders. But typically when I process one of these images, that's kind of what I'm looking for. Something where you can see clear red areas and clear blue areas, and blue areas are typically in the foliage, if nowhere else. And so we'll start with this. This is not in any way mimicking the way I actually processed that image when I prepared the version I've showed you, but it's probably not too far off either. And then you adjust exposure and shadows. Shadows are pretty dark, so we'll bring those up a bit. If you look at the histogram, you can see there's some data in the green channel here, but it's way down compared to the other two. It's not really affecting this image very much at all, the appearance of this image. You can see that the red channel is still pretty blown out, but we can fix that to a considerable degree by bringing down highlights and the whites. And we can bring that red channel into range by doing something like that. And if you think the shadows need to be a little lighter still, you can actually bring up the blacks a little bit. Make sure there's nothing buried against the, down in the black end of things. And this gives you a reasonably good, what I've got here is a reasonably good first take on what the image will look like. We want the image to look like out of the raw converter. It may be a little bright up here still, so I'm going to drop the whites and the highlights down a little more, but no big deal. And then texture, that emphasizes fine detail. Clarity emphasizes larger details, and I usually do add at least some clarity to these images, sometimes texture too, and in this case, because there's a lot of foliage here which has lots of texture, you might want to do that. There are ways you can do similar things in post-processing, so you don't necessarily have to do it here. But anyhow, okay, so much for what Adobe calls the basic adjustments. Detail, I don't touch most of these adjustments at all, but detail, as I said earlier, I set sharpening to 0, and noise reduction, I also have the manual settings set to 0. Color, actually, I don't touch that. That's the default value, and I just don't mess with it. This is that new denoise capability that's built into Camera Raw and Lightroom now. And I don't by default use it. I've only tried it with a few images, but it works really well, but it takes forever to run. And depending on the image, it actually might obscure some of your final details. But so I don't necessarily like it the times I've tried it, but it also does a really good job of recovering details that are buried really deeply in a high noise image, like that one I shot at the Camera Walk in Flagstaff a month or two ago at ISO 16,000, which had a huge amount of noise in it. And that sign for Motel de Beau, it was so buried so deeply in the noise that The other two noise reduction programs I tried couldn't, made it look like a mess, even though they got rid of the noise, but they got rid of most of the detail in that sign too. Camera Raw did a wonderful job with that sign. It recovered detail that I didn't even know was there. So in that particular instance, it worked well for me, but most of the time I don't use it because I haven't liked the results. Anyhow, so much for the detail settings. Then if you go down to optics, I usually do click remove chromatic aberration. I typically don't click use profile corrections, but there are exceptions to that. This is a wide angle lens, so it does have some distortion, and you can see if I click that profile corrections, it shifts things around a bit as it corrects that distortion. The nice thing about this, though, and this is true in DxO as well as Camera Raw, is you don't have to take the default values here. You can, if you want, you can slide that distortion setting down there, and maybe you like that. You can put it anywhere in between and get greater degrees of distortion. And you can even go beyond 100%. You can actually add distortion that's in the opposite direction of what your lens puts in if you want to. And there are definitely times where I do that. I don't know if I'll have time to show you an example or not, but especially with fisheye lenses, that's really powerful because you can get rid of as much or as little of that fisheye effect as you want to and get much different looks for your image by doing that. That's a sidelight here, but it's a useful thing to know about. So anyhow, that's what I typically do in Camera Raw when I'm processing an infrared image. And this image is now ready to be converted to a file, a TIFF file is what I always use, and post-processed. I'm not going to do that here because I already have a version of this image to show you when we.
Is that where you switch the channels? You switching the red channel and the blue channel?
That's in post-processing, not raw conversion. Yeah, you probably could figure out a way to do it in the raw conversion, but I'd say why bother, because and I'm actually, well, I guess I will actually click done here so it saves the changes I've made, although I don't think we need those for any reason. Anyhow, so that's an example of how I would process this image in Camera Raw. Now, going back to the slide package momentarily. Did that show up there? Yeah, but not as a slide presentation.
It's not over here either.
Oh, it isn't? Oh, so I have to click zoom. Well, actually, let's not. Where are we? We're not even at the same place in the presentation. I was talking about raw conversion and demonstration. So here's where we belong in the presentation. But now I'm going to go to DxO Photo Lab, and I will convert the same image if I can find it here quickly enough. And again, can you see that up there?
No, it's not.
Not coming through in
Zoom.
All right. All right. Well, first of all, let me see if I can trick it into displaying. Hello. Come on.
Took it again.
Yeah,
There's got to be an easier way to do it.
I'm sure. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I'll do some.
Okay. Now you're seeing my screen up there. Let's hope that if I exit out of this, can you now see? Yeah. Okay. So yeah, Photo Lab is now being shown on the screen behind me. So now all I got to do is figure out how to share it on.
Okay. It's on there.
All right, good. Okay, so let's go find that image now in DxO Photo Lab. And oops, no, not there. It's going to be here. It's going to be there. It's going to be way down here. And it's going to be here. And here is the unprocessed image as, oh, that's interesting. I haven't processed this image on this computer before, so it wants the lens profile and the camera plus lens profile for that specific combination. So I'm just going to go ahead and load that. It shouldn't take long. It's actually downloading it from a server in France, I think. That's where they're headquartered. But anyhow, it's now there. Okay, so now let's look at what you can do to process that image in DxO Photolab. As I mentioned, DxO Photolab has this built-in 4-man's ACR capability, and that's this little button right here. They call it smart lighting, and watch what happens when I click that button. Presto. Now you have detail in the shadows. It's also calmed down the highlights a significant amount, and it's only applied what it calls a slight adjustment. If that's not enough for you, just move this slider and you get a lot more. So presto, this is almost like having an HDR program built into your raw converter. It really is. It works remarkably well. And you can see the difference it makes between the unprocessed image and the image where that has been applied. So I love it. This is one of the main reasons I use DxO most of the time now rather than Camera Raw. You'll notice it's also brought a lot of ugly detail out in my out of focus left hand, but we're going to crop that out anyway, so don't worry about it. But again, look at what it's done for your details there. It's brought out all those shadows. It's tamed the highlights in the sky a little bit. It's just really nifty to have that. Okay, now I talked about the clarity and texture adjustments in Camera Raw. DxO has them too. It calls them different things, but it has this thing called Clearview Plus, which brings out a lot of detail. It emphasizes a lot of detail, basically by controlling local contrast. And so you can see, let me magnify this a little bit so you can see a little more of the detail. I'll turn that off, and then I'll turn it on, and you can see a difference. And again, you have control over how much of that you apply. And it has other things. It has, you know, highlight and shadow adjustments and all the sorts of things you'd expect your raw converter to have. I'm going to go back to the full screen display. So if you think those highlights in the clouds are still a little too bright, that's easy. Just click here somewhere and it'll darken them for you. Likewise, shadows and midtones and blacks. It's actually a little more flexible than the corresponding adjustments in Camera Raw, I think. It has contrast. It even has a gamma adjustment to it, which sometimes is handy. I'll just show you briefly what that does. It changes the shape of the tone curve to darken your shadows and boost contrast, but it's different from using an actual contrast slider because it changes the response curve. It changes the tone curve like a curves adjustment does in Photoshop or in Camera Raw for that matter. It's handy to use. I often use it. Okay, color balance. As I mentioned before, Camera Raw typically doesn't give you quite enough of a range unless you use a custom profile. This one has a similar capability, but I typically don't have to mess with custom profiles or anything. In fact, I don't even have custom profiles. But if we click this eyedropper tool here and then click a white cloud up here, they look very red right now. But if we go do that, presto, it does just what you'd expect. It turns the sky to shades of gray, gets rid of pretty much all the color. And as I mentioned previously, that's not typically what I like in post-processing. So I'm going to move the blue slider a little toward yellow and this cyan or this magenta green slider a lot towards its middle. And get to a point where, again, I have some red in the sky and blue in the foliage and clear distinction between the two. By the way, this shows a histogram all the time, and you can see the histogram doesn't have a lot of detail in the highlights. So I'm actually going to go back and I'm going to use this mid-tone slider to boost the levels of mid-tones without changing the sky too much. That may have been too much. I don't know. Let's see. No, I think that's pretty much okay. Somewhere in there, doesn't matter too much exactly where we put it. But, you know, that's what I do for color and for, you know, the tonality, the luminosity adjustments of the image. Okay. Some other things I do. First of all, the denoising capability. DxO, as I mentioned, has a really powerful denoise capability. They call it Deep Prime, and it's been added just in the last couple of versions of DxO. It's supposedly AI-based, does a really good job in my experience, but it also takes a lot of processing power. So it'll take it a few minutes, depending on your machine, and my machine isn't very powerful. I'm going to have to replace this laptop pretty soon, but anyhow, it does take it some time to process. It has other choices: high quality prime, deep prime, and deep prime XD, which is the most powerful of all. It gives you a preview of what that looks like here. It also has what it calls lens softness correction, and I always turn that on. I almost always leave it at the default values. And you can see this little preview here. Let me set that to a spot in the image that has some interesting detail. How about right there? Whoops, that's not what we wanted. Actually, I'm going to go back down there near where it was initially. Okay, so you can see some detail in the foliage and in those railings there. And if you turn this off, you can, I don't know if you can see from where you are, but you can see that those things look a little fuzzy without that lens softness correction, but they sharpen up pretty nicely in this preview when you turn it on. So I do those things. Down here, you'll see chromatic aberration. I turn on lateral chromatic aberration. And you typically, especially with infrared images, you typically can't see the results of that, but I always use it. And I think it does make a difference. And by the way, if you forget to turn off that little preview thing by clicking this button here, then it's, even when you go to other screens, you still see it. So you have to remember to turn that off. Okay, now distortion correction and vignetting correction. Actually, vignetting, I think is it on this page or the other one? I don't remember. It's on one of these pages. I often don't apply it. I often don't bother to apply it. But distortion, it has good distortion. It's probably, if anything, better than what's in Camera Raw, because it knows about camera plus lens combinations, not just the lenses themselves. And you have a lot of tweaks you can make to that. You can decide whether you want to use it or not. If you don't click this constrain to image box, then it'll actually show you, it tries to keep the full image. And that means when it corrects distortions, there are places where there aren't any pixels because it's moved the image in from the edges of your frame. So I typically keep that one checked. And this keep aspect ratio probably doesn't matter too much, but if it does, you're going to crop it anyway. That's correct. But with a fisheye lens, trust me, that matters a lot. It'll give you some very crazy looking images if you don't check this keep aspect ratio box. Okay, so in a nutshell, that's what I do with DxO typically. Both Camera Raw and DxO have pretty strong capabilities to save presets, so that if you've done it for one image, you can do it for, you apply exactly the same image to any other image you want. DxO and Photoshop too, at Camera Raw, they also have a way of copying settings from one image to another, which is also very powerful. I won't try and demonstrate those here. You can figure those out easily enough for yourself. But when you're all done with all that stuff, you click Export to Disk, and you get this interface. And I have some settings here that these are presets that I've set up for this. But it gives you a choice of 8-bit or 16-bit. It gives you a choice of file type. You can add an extension to the file name if you want. You can preserve EXIF data, metadata, that sort of thing. Do all those things, and when you've got and you can pick the file where it's going to save your image, destination here. And once you've done all those things, you click export, and it'll start churning away and give you a raw converted image. I'm not gonna do it here because it'll take a few minutes to do, and we have about half an hour left now, so.
Can it export as a DNG or is it always a TIFF?
I don't believe it will export as a DNG, but,
So you're going that
but you,
long.
I can take it back. It does, yes. It'll export it as a DNG with only denoise and operation, optical corrections applied, or with all corrections applied.
So you could then open it as a smart object if you wanted.
Conceivably, yeah. I haven't tried it, and
I'm not sure.
since Adobe and DxO are competitors, they might not play nice together. I don't know.
I've had other DNGs that smart objects and they work fine.
Yeah, I don't have much experience with it, so can't help you there, sorry. Anyhow, that's what the DxO raw converter looks like. And I think, let me go back to the slide package now, which is here. I believe, or no, yeah, easier said than done. Let's try this one. I think this is the right one.
Hey,
Hey,
you did.
both places? All right, wow.
You'll be a professional.
Don't count on it. I'm gonna be a professional. Somebody has to pay me to do this.
Oh, you're just being evaluated today.
This is an interview.
Yeah.
Okay. All right, questions or discussion about raw processing before we move on? I wasn't planning on spending quite that much time, but there's a lot to talk about and a lot more to talk about with all the post-processing.
There's always post.
Sorry?
Part 5.
We can consider that, yeah. After let's complete the 4 sessions we've already planned and then talk about maybe
There's so
extending
much
it.
you can do and so much depth in here. It's
There
just-
really is. Trust me, as I say, I could talk for a week about all the nuances of processing these images. But let's move on to post-processing here. General principles. First of all, your mileage will vary. There's no such thing as a standard workflow. The tools are constantly evolving, so you'll probably want to evolve with them as they improve, and they've improved a lot in the last few years, and the odds are the rate will just increase exponentially. So be prepared for that. Don't be discouraged if you arrive at an impasse. It certainly happens to me sometimes. I'll be processing an image and I'll get to a point where I don't like what I'm getting. I don't know where else to go. And the best thing to do in that situation, in my experience, is just set it aside. Come back to it tomorrow or next week, or don't come back to it at all if you don't feel like it. But often when you do come back to it, you'll have a new insight or a new inspiration and you'll be able to make further progress with it. Don't get discouraged by those impasses in any case. Okay, how many people here use layers in Photoshop? Raise your hand if you do. You're the exception, but we'll help you. But that's okay. I can, maybe if we have another session or two for this someday, maybe I'll go into more depth about that and help you get started with it. We'll figure something out. Automation, that's another thing. How many people here use Photoshop Actions? Okay, well, half of us or so. That's good. Photoshop Actions are just incredibly powerful. I already talked a little bit about it when I was talking about Camera Raw and the automation you can use there. I use Actions a lot. They do several things in addition to just saving time, which they do. I have Actions that have dozens and dozens of steps in them, and I'll probably, if I have time, I'll demonstrate how 1 or 2 of them work. So it can save you a huge amount of time in processing, because otherwise you'd have to, execute each of those steps manually. But what's even better than that, from my perspective, is they keep you honest. Because once you've figured out a sequence of commands that work to achieve some particular purpose, you record those as an action, and then you never have to remember them again. You never make mistakes and do them in the wrong order or anything like that. You just run that action and it gets them right every time. So keeping me honest is a tall order, and so I use them a lot for that purpose as well, and I can recommend them very highly.
Be careful if you delete them.
Oh, yeah, that's absolutely true. I've, in fact, Photoshop, Adobe has screwed me up a couple of times with that too.
With the update.
With updates where they just obliterate all your prior settings and actions and give you no way to recover them. So yes, outside the scope of the current session, but if you use actions, if you use presets, any of the other things like presets, and there are a lot of them built into Photoshop, save them all and back them up because it's easy to lose them. And you'll tear your hair out if you do, because they save you so much time potentially. Okay, presets, already talked about those. Use them if they'll help you, and they probably will. Third-party tools like Luminar, Nik Tools, etc. Use those if they help you, and again, they probably will. Okay, so I'm going to talk about an example. First of all, a sort of a generic example of the steps you might take when you're processing an infrared image for color. And if you notice, if you look at this slide, you'll notice all the steps here are labeled optional. And they're not necessarily in the order you would want to apply them either, although some of them are. Well, one or two of them are, I would recommend. But in general, you're improvising when you're processing one of these images. You try something, it might work, it might not. You back it out and try something else. So the sky's the limit. And okay, but anyhow, here's a kind of a skeleton of an example workflow. First of all, you start, once you've opened the image in Photoshop, you start by duplicating the background layer. So you leave it alone. You're not going to apply any changes to that background layer. You're going to, because you always want to be able to come back to that, even regardless of what else you've done with the image. There may be circumstances where you need or want to come back to that original background layer, the converted raw file, basically. Okay, so as I've already talked about, you might want to apply Topaz Photo AI or Topaz Sharpen AI if you still have the older version of those tools, and their noise reduction as well. If you haven't done that during raw conversion, and you may or may not do it during raw conversion. If you use DxO, you'll probably be satisfied with what you do during raw conversion. If you use ACR or Lightroom, in general, I advise not doing sharpening or noise reduction during raw conversion. Instead, save it for post-processing and do it at this stage for a color image. Now, swapping the red and blue channels. I'll show you an example of that. And I'll show, and that'll also illustrate why you would want to do that. So I'm not going to talk about it anymore here. Shift colors by hue saturation adjustments or selective color or color balance or a photo filter or lookup layers, LUTs they call them, lookup table. Yeah, that's right. Thank you. LUTs, those are all ways of altering the colors of any image, and they work very well sometimes for infrared images. So those are all things you could apply, and then optionally apply third-party tools like Luminar or like Nik Tools. Those can be very useful as well. So I have some examples here. We have about 20 or 25 minutes left in this session. So let me again switch screens. I'm going to go to Photoshop. Which window should I go to? This one here, I believe, is the right one. Okay, did that come up there?
And I have it here.
You have it there. You have it there. You have it there. Boy, oh boy. All right, we're not looking at this actual image anymore, but let me find the one I want to start with here. Which one is it? Not that one. Come on, this is it. Okay, so this is that coffee or that treehouse on the coffee grounds of the coffee company in Hilo, Hawaii, or Kona, Hawaii, rather. And I'm going to turn off all of the layers in here to start with, except, well, if it'll, now suddenly it's locked up on me. That's handy. Okay, now we're back. I'm going to turn off all these layers and go down to the background layer, the original layer that was in here after raw conversion, and that's what it looks like. And that's actually not too different from the one I showed you in the raw conversion example. There's less red. Yeah, there's less red in the sky, but that's okay.
I like this.
Oh, okay. Oh, that's fine. Your mileage will vary, as I say. All right, so the first thing I did was I ran it through Photoshop or Topaz Photo AI, and that's just to sharpen it. I won't even show you the results of that, and remove noise too. Worked quite well, as it almost always does. Then the next thing I did was I added a black and white layer and converted it to a black and white image. And there's what it looked like. I'm actually going to show you a little bit about the process for that, because it's pretty significant when you're talking about black and white conversions in general, be they visible or infrared. So I'm actually going to pull up the properties for that black and white layer and show you what they look like here. There's a slider for each of 6 different colors here, and they're basically the primary colors for both the RGB and the CMYK color spaces. It doesn't have a black. That's the only one that's missing, but it's got all those other primary colors, whether you're talking about additive or subtractive colors. And you'll notice they're all set at much different values here. So if I go back to the default, there's what it looks like with the default settings for this particular tool, not particularly to my liking. I have a bunch of presets already loaded here, and there are some that come with Photoshop as well. So you can easily scroll through those. You pick the top one, then you just use your up and down arrow keys. You can see it gives a different name for each of those presets, and they all look rather different from each other. And what they do, you can see those sliders jumping around all over the place as I do that too. And you get a much different look to the image depending on how all those sliders are set. And not all of them are very appealing, but some of them are fairly close to the final result that I wanted here. This one is pretty close to the final result. And I'll show you just as an illustration how much difference those sliders make. What these sliders control, if you're not familiar with this tool, they control how bright the original red, like taking the red as an example, that tells you how bright the red colors in the original color image will be in the converted black and white image. So we know there's some red in the sky, so watch what happens if I move that red slider. Lightens up the sky a whole lot. It has effects elsewhere too, but it really has a large effect on that sky because that's where a lot of the red is in this image. So you can get much different looks out of this image just by manipulating that one slider. So put it wherever you want, put it wherever it looks good, basically. Magenta, that's a cross between red and blue. So often in a case like this, magenta will sort of control the overall brightness of the image, but different images behave differently depending on the color balance that you set during raw processing and stuff like that. But you can see magenta has a more subtle effect than the red does, but it controls how much that treehouse stands out against the background and how dark the shadows are and things like that. Okay, we know that the foliage in the original image was blue. So look what that blue slider does to the foliage. It can make it really bright or really dark. And cyan is kind of like blue, so it has a similar, but in this case, more muted effect on the foliage. Look what green does.
I think.
Nothing. Remember earlier I said the green doesn't really matter too much, at least with this filter, the 590 nanometer filter. There's why, in a nutshell. Yellow is similar to red, so sometimes you'll see effects similar to adjusting the red slider. You can see the yellow mostly just affects what's in the sky, but only specific parts of the sky in this case. So it's a little more limited than the red slider. Anyhow, so that's what those color sliders do when you're converting an image to black and white. And as I say, even though we're talking about an infrared image here, has equally pronounced effects. They have equally pronounced effects in color images, except then that green slider will make more of a difference than it does here. So you can get a huge range of different looks to a black and white image just by using that one black and white conversion layer. And by the way, if you don't want to use layers, you can also, there's an adjustment up here that applies that same image or that same adjustment. Well, now Photoshop is locked up again on me. Gotta wait for it to wake up. Okay, here we go. Go to Image, Adjustments, and black and white. And presto, you get exactly the same interface that gives you all those sliders to slide around. You can also colorize the image, add a little bit of color toning to it if you want. I won't illustrate that here. But you can do this even if you don't use layers yet, if you want to. Though I recommend strongly using layers. Okay, so I'm going to go back to history here and go back to the point before we modified that black and white layer. And we'll look at the layers here and proceed further. The next layer here is labeled IR diffusion, and it's a special effect I was hoping we'd have time to talk about a little bit. I don't think we will, but if I apply it, you'll notice it makes everything look a little bit hazy, especially the highlights. And that's actually mimicking Kodak's old black and white infrared film, which had exactly that effect. It tended to diffuse light sideways along the film plane, along the actual emulsion layer of the film, and make stuff look a little bit hazy. And it's a look that people kind of got used to in infrared images. So you can, I have an action that does that for you. And I'll be happy to share these actions with everybody, by the way. And you'll notice I only have that layer set at 20% opacity. You can get a much more pronounced effect if you move that opacity slider around. You can get more than you want, obviously, but
You have a light and blend mode, I see.
yeah, correct, yeah, because that's kind of how the film behaved in this respect. I'm going to set it back to where it was, and so that's
Is
the
it a Gaussian blur?
a Gaussian. It's no, it's a different, I don't remember exactly how I do it. I have to look at the action to keep myself honest to figure out exactly how I did it. Here's another layer that I call Blur Baby, which is my own private terminology for Lens Baby. And what this capability does, and again, it's an action I've created, it mimics the effect of a Lens Baby, which is to say you get a central sharp region of your image and then blurring around the periphery. And I haven't applied very much of that here. I don't even know if you can see it very readily. But if you look at these palm trees over here. When I turn that layer off, they look nice and sharp. If I turn it on, they look a little bit hazy. But you don't see any change. Like, look at the foliage here. When I turn that layer off, you don't see any difference at all in the middle of the picture when I turn it off and on.
Is it a radial type thing or is
Yeah.
it? Okay.
Yes, it is. And as I say, if we have an advanced session someday, I'll show you more about how that works. I do this almost with all my images these days, with visible as well as infrared images. What it does is it decreases the contrast around the edges And that into your eye is drawn to the higher contrast portions of an image. So it draws your eye inward toward your subject. So as I say, I do that with just about every image I make. This is a toning layer. It applies just a little bit of a blue tone to it. And again, in the interest of time, we only have about 10 minutes left. I'm not going to show you how to do that now, but we'll have to save that for the next session or something. This is something I often do with infrared images. After I've converted them to black and white, I actually take the original layer, or in this case, probably this sharpened layer, the photo AI layer, and I duplicate it, move it up here, and name it add back color. And what I'm doing with that, as the name implies, is I'm adding back a little bit of the original color that was there in this image that's now been converted to black and white. And that's what that looks like. And so now again, you have the foliage as a faint blue and the sky a faint red color. The opacity of this is 40%. So it's not all the color that was present originally, but it's a little bit of it. This is a dodge and burn layer, and I did that just to darken all of this stuff in the foliage because it was standing out too much to my eye. Now, sorry, can you see the difference there? I turn that layer off and then turn it on. Okay, this is the channel mixer layer. This is where I swap the red and blue channels. And
You did it after all the other stuff,
yeah, I did.
rather than at the beginning.
Well, because I wasn't sure what I wanted when I started. And in fact, this is a perfectly valid and workable IR image as is. I decided ultimately that I liked it better with the channels swapped, so I did it. And hopefully I'll have a chance to demonstrate that for you, how it's done. If not, again, we'll save it for next time. But in the links that I provide at the end of the package, there's a link to an article that tells you how to do it too. I have an action that does it, which again keeps me honest and saves me time, but you can do it manually easily enough as well. Okay, then I have some other adjustments to the colors, hue and saturation, exposure. And exposure provides basically a gamma adjustment. So I'll actually show you what that looks like here in the properties panel, because that's pretty significant and I use it pretty often. I showed you what it looked like in the raw conversion, but the exposure tool has this gamma correction setting in it. You'll notice I have it set at 0.8, and by default it comes up at 1.0. Gamma basically darkens the shadows selectively, and it alters the response curve as well in doing that. And so it gives you more contrast. It also subtly increases the saturation of your colors. You can probably see that if I take it away here momentarily. Colors look more saturated. And you can apply it as much or as little as you want. This is 80% here is where I had it, or at 0.8 is where I had it, but you can change it more and get even more dramatic looks if you want. You know, seasoned to taste basically. But it's often helpful to just to make an image look more dramatic or have a little more impact.
And you use it normal blend mode?
That one, yeah, that's correct. It's an adjustment layer, so typically that's what you would use it for. And then finally, brightness and contrast, because they typically come out a little on the dark side, especially true if you're printing. I mean, you probably want to lighten them up a bit before you send it to a printer. And then here's I haven't labeled it properly, but this is the layer where I darken the edges, and I have an action that makes that easy to do as well. I won't try and cover it now because we just don't have time. And then I add my signature to it by doing that. I've created a brush that has my signature on it that I apply on almost any image I share publicly. And finally, a brightness contrast layer because the final result was a little bit dark. So that's the ultimate image, and that illustrates the workflow. And I wish I had more time to show you more detail about those individual steps, but unfortunately, we only have a few minutes left. So that's the illustration of the workflow for a color image. And as I say, I'm going to go back to where we started, and you'll notice it's the same as where we ended up, which means I put everything back where it belonged. So the workflow is a little different for a black and white image, and I think the one I was going to show you is over here. Yeah. This is a chapel in Wilmington, North Carolina. Historic chapel. It's some Protestant denomination. I don't know, Methodist or something, I guess. I don't remember. This is a black and white infrared image, and it was made with a fisheye lens. So, and you can see a little bit of that distortion, although this isn't anywhere near as much distortion as was originally there. I toned that down quite a bit during raw conversion, but I like what I was left with, so this is what I did. But this one obviously is converted to black and white. So let me go back down to the base layer here, which is this one. And that looks pretty ugly to my eye, but that's the original image as it came out of the raw converter. And I don't even remember which raw converter I used for this one. And I don't know why I accepted this image looking like this out of the raw converter. I guess probably because I could see a clear distinction between the blues in the foliage and the red in the sky. And you can even see there's some ivy growing around this door here, and you can see the blue from that. So it looked like it had potential as I worked through the post-processing to give me what I wanted. And I was pretty sure when I started with this one that I was going to want it to be a black and white image. It just looked like the kind of subject that would work well in black and white. So the first thing I did was convert it to black and white. And that looks pretty ugly too. It's too bright, it's lacking detail and highlights, and the shadows are too light, and all kinds of things wrong with that. But then I used that exposure adjustment there to bring down those shadows and improve the contrast as well, plus a brightness contrast adjustment to brighten it up a bit. And you'll notice here is where I applied the Sharpen AI tool. This is an older image before they came out with Photo AI. So I used Sharpen AI to apply Topaz sharpening capabilities to it. And I waited until I had done most of the processing that would affect the individual pixels. And the reason I do it that way, the order is different when you're doing black and white images here. And that's because if you do that sharpening step too early in the workflow, it somehow introduces artifacts in the black and white image that you don't see in a color image. And I don't know particularly why that happens, but I can tell you it does happen. I've seen it in plenty of instances, and I've had to go back and redo images because of that sometimes when I've decided late in the game to convert them to black and white, and then discovered that when I sharpen them, it shows those images, or it shows those, or then, sorry, when I convert to black and white, suddenly those artifacts appear that weren't there in the color version. So, sorry, go ahead.
Color, yeah, because you did it pretty soon.
Yeah.
And when you're still dealing with contrast and stuff, you can introduce noise and stuff.
Yeah, and again, my experience is it doesn't seem to matter very much with color. Topaz's directions basically advise you to do the sharpening as early in your post-processing workflow as you can. But as I say, that advice works pretty well for color images, but less so for black and white.
Use the Sharpen AI color too. Is that?
I'm sorry?
Did you use Sharpen AI, Topaz Sharpen?
Yes,
AI
I did. Yeah,
also?
that's correct. Yeah. Well, and with the color image, I used that. I processed that one more recently, so I used Topaz Photo AI for that one, which has sharpening and noise reduction both built in.
EXO thing.
Yeah, no, in the image I just showed you, the one from Hawaii, the tree house.
Oh, okay.
So yeah, but anyhow, yeah, so I sharpened later in the workflow, and after I've done most of my adjustments of the pixels and stuff, in this case, not all of them, but I was okay with it. I didn't find any significant artifacts with this particular workflow. Now, then I applied Luminar Neo, another tool, and the adjustment there is pretty subtle, you can see, but I used it to boost the contrast a bit more and bring out the details a bit more in that scene. I applied that infrared diffusion action again, and again, it's not too pronounced here. Again, it's only 10% opacity, but you can see the trees just start looking a little hazy. The foliage starts looking a little bit hazy when I turn that layer on. I applied that Blur Baby tool again, the action, and that, again, it decreases the contrast around the periphery of the image and tends to help draw your eye toward the center. Exposure, I applied another gamma adjustment basically to bring those shadows back down after all that. You get this nice dark sky, which is very characteristic of infrared film images, black and white infrared film images, which I like. And then I applied I darkened the edges. Again, helps draw your eye in to the, oh, actually, I forgot to turn off one layer at the top. So this was the original image after I did all those things. And then I added my signature to it and concluded that the shadows looked too dark in here. So I brightened everything up with a brightness contrast layer. And that's the final result. And, you know, one of the things I love about infrared is how it makes foliage glow. This is a fern growing next to that bush there. Glows pretty nicely in infrared with all these adjustments. And I'm afraid we're going to have to close things out now. We're actually out of time. I'm going to go back to the slide package. And I've shown you black and white and color. I haven't had time. This is the final slide in the package, I think, but tips, tricks, and hazards. Oh, there's one other example. If you don't mind, I'm going to take 2 more minutes to show you one more example, which I think is worth showing you. In people photos, in infrared, you can get people's veins showing through their skin. Infrared penetrates skin, light-colored skin especially, better than visible light does. And I'll show you an example of that. I talked about the IR diffusion, but let me go back briefly to, let's see, how do we want to do this? Let's go back to Photoshop here. And I will share that image. And well, I will try to. That screen. Hang on, I'm gonna have to get out of there and go to Photoshop down here, I guess. Where is it? Okay, put the layers back where they belong. Down here. And where is that image I wanted to show you? Not that one. This is the one. Okay, this is from a model shoot I did a few years ago, and this was using that Nikon D3200 with a 590 nanometer filter, and process to put a nice glow on the foliage in the background. And this is the model. She's actually a rock and roll singer and guitarist. Her name is Winter Amy. It's possible you've heard of her because she performs locally in the Verde Valley quite a bit with her band. But she served as the model for this photo shoot and looks pretty good until you look at it in more detail, I think. She certainly looks good in there, I think. But I'm going to blow it up to full size. Well, I'm going to try to. Hello. Where is my cursor all of a sudden? There we go. Okay, it's blown up to full size. And I'm going to show you what her legs look like. She has very light skin. I think she's probably a natural blonde.
Oh my God.
And look how those veins No. So here's an opportunity for some retouching and, to use the clone stamp or something to get rid of those veins. But this is what can happen. And in my experience, it only happens with people who have really light skin. Or at least that's where it's most visible. But watch out for that if you shoot people in infrared, because it is definitely one of the hazards. And with that, I think I'm going to wrap things up. So I can stop screen sharing here, I guess. Let's see here.